All right, Psalm 116. Let's call this one God's brand is deliverance. In this psalm, where the psalmist is going to start out essentially thanking God because he actually took the time to listen. And in a time when we can often be criticized as believers for believing in a God that we can't see, who isn't actually listening to us, those times when we actually know the difference between where we were and where we are now is basically a prayer. That thing that can seem superstitious, but if we were absolutely honest, it was the thing that marked the shift in our perspective. And in this psalm, this psalmist is thanking God for the evidence that he has listened in a time when he was once in despair. In the first few verses, verses 1 and 2, saying he loves God because he heard me and he inclined. And because of that reason, I will continue to call on God, the psalmist will say as he goes into verses 3 and 4, when he will say, snares encompassed him. Then he called on the Lord, and it is only fair to recognize that no matter how superstitious my prayers might seem, the prayers that I offered up to God marked the point at which my situation actually shifted. And so likewise, that is my superimposed perspective on times when I have known that to happen in my life. And this psalmist is saying essentially the same thing as he goes on to verses 5 through 7, where he will say, gracious is God, not simply looking for those who are perfect, as we've noticed in previous chapters leading up to this one. He preserves the simple. Those times when in my simplicity, I've made mistakes that have made my own condition miserable. This psalmist is going to likewise say, God saves or preserves the simple, and likewise, he saved me. As he goes on in verses 8 and 9 to encourage himself to return to God, understanding that in times when God has delivered us and allows us to go on in periods of relative peace, it can be easy to go on back into ways that led us into misery in the first place. So he's reminding himself before he gets there, return to God insofar as he seems to recall what it's like to be in despair, which seems to be what he's getting at in verses 10 and 11, where he says, I believed I was greatly afflicted, quite possibly because he might have been greatly afflicted. But he's going to go on to say, I believe that all men are liars, and that might be an exaggeration. Understanding that when we get into times where we are surrounded by troubles, we can begin to look at all of life through the lens of our troubles, exaggerating the significance of the adversary or the hard times that we're facing. A theme that we've seen developed in the lives of God's people who we've seen leading up to this point in the Psalms, as he is going to go on to say in verses 12 through 14. Once again, now that I have that perspective that is no longer stuck in the middle of my despair, a famous quote which goes, what shall I render to Jehovah? For he has done so very much for me. As he begins to conclude the rest of the chapter by speaking of the ways that he will thank God publicly for all of the ways that God has lifted him out of his despair, reminding me of a story that Jesus told, not even a story that Jesus told, but a story that comes out of the life of Christ when a woman who was identified as a publicly sinful or a publicly ostracized woman comes into an assembly or a gathering in the home of one of the Pharisees and begins to wash Jesus's feet with her tears and wipe it with her hair, provoking one of the Pharisees to say, if this man was a prophet, he wouldn't even be letting this woman touch him. At which point Jesus asks that Pharisee a question that helps him realize, because this woman had been forgiven much, or quite possibly pulled out of a pit of tremendous despair, she began to care less about all of the shame that would have been heaped upon her for the public display of appreciation she heaped upon Jesus. Reminding me of this psalm and the way it ends with the psalmist making a very public display of thanks for the way that God has brought him out of his very own despair. Reminding us all that part of God's brand is deliverance, even in times when problems may be all we seem to be able to see.